The following incident took place in Victoria, Australia, where on April 7th, 1966, a 19-year-old motor mechanic by the name of Gary Taylor lost his life when his car ran off the Bendigo St Arnaud Road near Birmingham, which is 74 kilometres from the nearest town of Bendigo and 207 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, the capital of Victoria. Blood tests showed that Gary had not been drinking, and the local police could not understand how the young mechanic had left the road and crashed on a straight stretch of road. However, at the same time, they'd been receiving reports about unusual, unidentified lights in the sky. While still baffled over the death of the young mechanic, a man by the name of Ronald Sullivan, a steel construction worker, who came to the police station with a story about a frightening experience he'd had at the exact same location 3 nights previously. Ronald had been driving his new Ford Falcon when all of a sudden his headlights started to bend to the right for no apparent reason. He said that if he'd followed the headlights, it would have run off the road and possibly suffered the same fate as Gary Taylor, but managed to stop the car before it crashed. Ronald then looked up, and in a nearby field he could see strange lights that appeared to be all the colours of the spectrum. They looked like 5-centimetre diameter tubes that ran into a bright phosphorus glow on the ground. The lights then stretched up into the dark sky and vanished. Ronald then drove another 1 hour and 50 minutes to the small town of Wycheproof, where he had his headlights checked out, and asked what would make them suddenly bend like that. The mechanic could offer no explanation and was told his lights were in perfect condition. Next day, Ronald returned to the location with the police where his headlights bent, and then to the field where he saw the strange lights. As they were walking around the field, they came upon a depression in the ground that made a perfect circle that was 1.2 metres in diameter and 15 centimetres deep. They approached the farmer, who could offer no explanation as to what could have caused the circle, and it was no farming implement that he had ever used. 12 years later, in February 1978, members of the Victorian UAP Research Society revisited the field and were able to photograph the round depression that was now barren and a bare ring where nothing grew. Apparently, many similar circles around the world have the same problem, where they remain sterile and devoid of any vegetation. It also seems that many similar events such as strange lights and aerial phenomena become part of a pattern, and the Bendigo St Arnaud Road case was no exception. On further research, they found that 6 years earlier, on the 30th November 1972, another motorist had complained of unusual headlight behaviour, and moments later witnessed a strange object in a nearby field. On December the 7th, a local newspaper called the Murray Valley Standard reported an incident where a young mechanic had experienced disturbing problems while he was driving. Neville Maxwell was taking his car for a trial run along the road, where the engine started revving and his lights started to flash high and low as he reached the crest of a hill. As he got out of the car to check the engine, he witnessed an object that was the size of 2 cars. The base of the object was flashing green and purple lights. Now terrified, Neville Maxwell quickly went back into the car and ensured all the doors were locked, but he could not get his car to start. And when he turned on the radio, all he heard was strange noises. His engine was completely dead, and it remained that way for another 40 minutes. From the safety of his locked car, he looked around and could still see the unusual object in the nearby field. All of a sudden it rose up from the ground and made a whirring noise, and when it reached about 6 metres from the ground, shot off into the sky. After the object had completely vanished, he was able to start his engine again without any problems and slowly made his way home. The following day, the garage where he worked did a thorough inspection of the vehicle and found no problems whatsoever. In December 1989, farmers by the name of Nancy and Max Jolly and their son Stuart had taken strange photographs on their 9,000 hectare wheat property called West Park in the Mallee in northwest Victoria, and were convinced that a gigantic craft had landed on their farm. Also, 2 close neighbours by the name of Brian Finch and Austin Grace had found something that they were unable to comprehend. They were riding their international combine harvester in the field to strip the crop from the elevated cabin on the machine. They suddenly found themselves looking down upon 2 large swirled circles of wheat that were about 3 metres in diameter, surrounded by 3 smaller circles that were each about 1 metre in diameter. The Jollies believed that some huge force had left an imprint in the wheat. The ground inside the circles was rock hard, where the ground outside the circles was soft. The stalks on the circles of wheat were unbroken and swirled anti-clockwise, and everything looked as if it had been woven like a straw basket. The incident installed both fear and mystery for the Jolly family. Nancy Jolly also recalled an incident 2 years previously in November 1987 after viewing a series of strange lights over the property, and on later inspection found that their 4,000-litre water tank had been totally drained overnight. A year later in 1988, Stuart Jolly was suddenly awoken by an extremely loud noise outside the bedroom window. It was so loud that Stuart feared it had shattered his eardrums. He described the sound like screaming jet engines revving up and down, along with the sound of thousands of cicadas. His dog ran away, and as he walked out of the house to look up at the sky, there was nothing to see. It was a loud sound coming from an empty sky. 1 year later, in 1989, at about 9 p.m, he could hear absolute pandemonium coming from the sheep paddock. As he walked across to the paddock, he observed their 700 ewes and lambs running around berserk in a total panic. He then looked up at the sky and saw a yellow light that appeared to be pulsating and making a high-pitched sound. He could see that it was a yellow light and the noise that was sending them crazy. He then looked across to his neighbour Brian Finch's farm, and the same panic was happening to his livestock as they were trying to run away from something. The light then slowly vanished. When his wife and son arrived home an hour later, they went out to the field with torches and came across a wedge-tailed eagle that had a wingspan of about 2 metres, stumbling around the field in a panic and appeared to be in shock. It looked totally disorientated and appeared incapable of lifting off. It had lost its sense of balance, but fortunately, the following morning, it had gone and must have recovered. There appeared to have been much activity in the Mallee, where another neighbour called Aileen Casey reported a mysterious light hovering over her dam. A pilot by the name of John O'Shettle then asked to fly over the farm to take photographs. John observed hundreds of swirling circles that extended across a vast region of many of the neighbouring farms. He later said that there was no way the circles could have been a hoax, as they could only have been seen from a great height, such as in a plane or high above the ground in the cabin of a harvester. Practical jokers would have found it impossible to compress the soil into a rock-hard state, as well as the accuracy of the circles. The incidences that took place in Victoria has happened all around the world, but nobody knows why, and is even the experts baffled.
It must be a hugely unnerving experience to realise that your actual workplace is haunted. Somewhere you need to attend every day simply to put food on the table. Here are 3 such personal accounts from Weird World viewers. Alex. Alex sent a true story of something that happened to him many years ago. It was the last of 3 chilling events that occurred while he worked as a support worker in a home in the community, and the final straw that forced him to leave his job due to the terror he experienced. In 1995, he was working as a support worker in a community home in South Wales, United Kingdom, which housed adults with learning disabilities. He had worked there for more than 4 years and was very happy in the job. The house was a newly built long bungalow which accommodated 4 residents. As part of Alex's job, he had to do regular sleep-ins, which required 1 member of staff staying overnight to be on site in case they were needed. He had done many sleep-ins over the years, and these had always been uneventful. But then, around March 1995, strange things started happening. The events of one night in particular frightened him so much that he left the job he had loved so much, as he was too afraid to stay in the house. On the night in question, 3 of the 4 tenants had retired to bed, and all the other staff had left for the night. Alex was in the living room with the eldest tenant, who was called Paul. The TV was in the corner of the room, and Alex was seated on a sofa at the other end of the room. Paul was sitting in a large armchair right next to the TV, directly opposite Alex. At about 11 o'clock, Alex went across to Paul, who had no verbal capabilities, and asked him if he was ready for bed. Paul stood up and took Alex's hand. The pair walked out of the living room and Alex shut the door behind them. After he had helped Paul to bed, he walked back down the long corridor and went straight to the kitchen at the end, where he put the kettle on. As he drank a cup of coffee, he filled in the evening resident reports before reading the newspaper for a while. Then, at around midnight, he decided to return to the living room to watch TV for a while before going to bed. As he opened the living room door, he was immediately struck with the most terrible fear. The large armchair, which Paul had been sitting in earlier, was now pulled out into the centre of the room, facing the TV. Alex knew he had not returned to that room and knew 100% that no resident had left their room in the past hour. At that time, he did not equate what was happening as possibly being supernatural. Instead, he felt certain that someone must have gained access to the house. In panic, he raced to the utility room beyond the kitchen and pulled a lump hammer from one of the cupboards. He then methodically went to every room, checking that all the windows were closed and locked, and entirely expecting to meet an intruder at some point. The thought that he might have to engage with an intruder scared him, but as it turned out, there wasn't one. This fact terrified him even more. Realizing that the only rational explanation for the chair moving wasn't possible, he was left bewildered and terrified. He went back to the doorway of the living room, lump hammer still in hand, and stared at the chair, still in the centre of the room and still facing the TV. He was too scared to move, and to this day cannot remember how he managed to stand in the doorway holding a heavy lump hammer for many hours, but he did. Finally, at some point he realised that through the gap in the curtains, it was beginning to get light. He hadn't slept all night and doesn't know what happened during his lost time, but he knew the day staff would be arriving soon. Emboldened by the dawn sunlight, he gathered enough courage to enter the living room and slowly move the armchair back to its usual position. The next day, he started to apply for other jobs and thankfully was soon successful and left what had been his dream job. Now, some 28 years later, Alex still cannot explain his experience, and it still haunts his memory to this day. Gerard. In 1979, Gerard was working at Markham Main Colliery in South Yorkshire, UK, when this strange phenomenon occurred. It was a normal Tuesday night when he was going down to work in the pit, and he collected his 2 chits, one for going down the pit and the other to hand in when he returned back up to the surface. He changed his clothes, then went to the cage of the mine shaft to descend down the pit. On reaching the bottom, he had to walk with other men for about 10 metres to find out where they were working. He got onto the paddy wagon, which was like a train but pulled on wire, and reached his destination, where he was working on a conveyor belt connected to the coal faces. The 21 and 22 coal faces met by a chute, which now and then became blocked by a big piece of coal, which he had to break up. He radioed to get assistance, as there was a mechanism which stopped the conveyor belts, and on this occasion he was using a brand new system just installed. The night shift had been going for a good hour when Gerard looked behind him at an old runway, which had been closed off years ago. He felt hesitant to walk halfway down, which he needed to do to continue his work. In the normally warmish environment, he suddenly started to feel very cold and to see a thick mist coming from nowhere. Feeling terrified, he jumped back into his wagon seat and didn't turn around due to fear of what he would see. About 15 minutes later, the space returned to the usual warm temperature, and it took him a good hour to look around to see no mist and a normal runway. The following night, he went to work and, on picking up his chits, found a note saying he had to see the manager. Thinking nothing of it, he later went over to the manager's office and found a large group of people outside who told him that there had been a fire on coalface 21. This puzzled him because number 21 had displayed a green safety light all night. Gerald was grilled for over 20 minutes by the manager and the corporate bosses from London who had travelled up to the colliery. He eventually told them about the unusual thick mist he had seen the night before. He finally went down to the pit to work at about 4 a.m. After finishing his shift at around 8 a.m, Gerard got to the top of the pit and went to the lamp room to hand back his battery and helmet torch. Then one of his co-workers pulled him aside and asked him about what had happened the night before. He asked if Gerard knew about the guy who had lost his life on the conveyor belt. Gerard had not, but deputies who had inspected the old runway had seen the evidence of the fatality. Some who had seen it never went back down the pit again, and many others had to take early retirement due to trauma from seeing it. The colliery was closed in 1996, but Gerard still wonders about the apparent spiritual presence he had encountered. Conrad from Texas, USA, works in a tool store and reports that he has had several otherworld encounters there in the 3 years of his employment. The latest was in mid-February 2023 when he was placing products in the back of the store and had what was this time an unnerving physical experience. He was able to describe it in very specific terms because of how it felt. The little finger or pinky, ring finger and middle finger on the right hand of someone or something brushed his neck on the right side, behind his ear and down closer to the earlobe. At the time, there was only himself and his boss in the store. He asked her location at the time of his experience, and she was at the front of the store when it happened. He sensed that she is aware that something is not right in the store. Objects have fallen off peg hooks with no one nearby, and even just after putting them back. Items lying flat on shelves have simply slid off by themselves. But never in 3 years had Conrad been touched and was still feeling freaked out by the encounter when he contacted Weirdworld.
Can a person vanish without a trace only to appear in a parallel universe? What if you woke one day believing you were in the same world but found things had changed? You are the same person but in a different reality. The following case took place on July 16, 2008, when a 41-year-old Spanish woman by the name of Lorena Garcia Gordo claimed to have woken up in a parallel universe. One night she went to sleep as per usual, and the following day noticed that there were small, unusual inconsistencies happening from the moment she woke up. The very first thing that caught her attention was that her bed sheets were not the same colour, and sat up in bed totally confused and disturbed. In fact, the sheets were not only a different colour, but were a completely different set. Lorena could find no rational explanation as to why this had happened. However, not to be deterred, she still had breakfast and headed off to work at the office, where she'd worked for the past 20 years. Not everything had changed at that stage, as fortunately her car was still in the same location where she'd left it the previous day. She then drove down the same road that she'd been driving on since moving into her apartment 7 years ago. Other than the bed linen, her days seemed to be starting out like any other day, but things would again take a strange twist when she arrived at the office. As she entered the building, she saw a lot of strange faces that she'd never seen or met before, but did not let that deter her in any way and continued to walk to her office. But when she reached the door of her office, she found a different name on the door, and it was not her name. Looking for a rational explanation, she'd figured she'd gotten off at the wrong floor in the building, but when she looked around, found she was definitely on the right floor and it was definitely her office. So why had her name been replaced on the door? Confused and thinking the worst, like maybe she'd been fired, but nobody had the decency to tell her, even though she'd worked there for the past 20 years. She thought it rather insulting. She then proceeded to take out her laptop and then plug it into the company's network. Fortunately, she could see that her name was still on the company roster, but found she was now under a different manager and in another department altogether. Totally confused, Lorena had to compose herself as she had no idea what was happening to her. To confirm who she was, Lorena pulled out her credit card, driver's license and work ID, which all showed the correct information as far as she could tell. They all showed the same name, same photo ID, and luckily, the same address. In trying to get to the bottom of what was happening to her, she thought it best she took the day off and called in sick. Her life had suddenly been thrown into total chaos, and Lorena's first thought was that there was something medically wrong, and made an appointment to see her doctor. He then ran tests on her and checked for any signs of drugs that could have altered her sense of reality, but the tests came back negative and hadn't even shown any traces of alcohol in her system. In an attempt to get to the bottom of everything, Lorena went home to check through all her personal files, which included bank statements, checks and bills, but all of them were in order with the correct information. Still believing that something was wrong with her, she suddenly had a thought that maybe she was suffering from some sort of amnesia. What if something had recently happened to her and she'd forgotten certain parts of her life? She then went online to check the internet and could see that the news and other stories were the same as the day before, so there were no missing days. As far as Lorena could tell, most things in her life were the same, but at the same time when she woke up that morning, her life had changed slightly. But her life was to take another strange twist. Lorena had broken up with her boyfriend 6 months earlier after being together for the past 7 years. She was now embarking on a new relationship and had recently been dating a man called Augustin, who only lived down the road from her apartment. Although they'd only been seeing each other for 4 months, she'd gotten to know him quite well. She decided to call his home phone number, but some stranger picked up the phone instead. They said they knew no one by the name of Augustin or anyone who even matched his description living in the house. Lorena could not understand what was happening to her life, as she spent the last 4 months getting to know him and had even met his son, who she was developing a positive relationship with. It looks as if Augustin and his son had been erased from her life. Over the next few days, Lorena would find even more inconsistencies in her life. However, her life had to go on and she went to work the following day pretending that nothing had happened and everything was normal. Lorena continued to search for Augustin in other ways, but without any luck. It was as if he and his son had never existed, as if her life was not in enough turmoil. She would shortly find that she'd never even left her ex-boyfriend and their 7-year relationship had continued, and there was no sign that they'd even separated. Lorena did not understand where her life was going and what had happened to her old personal life and career, and thought that maybe she'd had a nervous breakdown where false memories had been implanted into her head, and believed the next course of action was to seek psychiatric treatment. However, tests showed that she was healthy in both body and mind, and the doctors believed she may have been under a lot of stress and could have hallucinated everything, but Lorena could not accept that theory. All the while she continued to search for Augustin without any luck, and even hired an investigator, but he could find no trace of him or his son in the city. Things got even worse for Lorena when she asked her family about her younger sister's shoulder operation, but they looked at her confused, not knowing what she was talking about. But Lorena insisted that her sister had recently had surgery on her shoulder. Her family were now starting to question her sanity. Over the following months, Lorena would find more differences in her life, such as strange clothing in her drawers. Blogs she'd previously posted in the last few months had vanished, along with emails and chat sites. Yet all the news sites were the same from before she went to bed on that fateful night. As the months passed without any answers, Lorena now felt she had gone to bed one night and had somehow awoken in a parallel universe. The fact that all medical treatment had failed to find anything wrong with her, her only other option was to make a post in an online forum about her ordeal and ask for help, or possibly if it had happened to anyone else, and is convinced that she had somehow jumped into an alternative reality and that some actions she had taken had changed her reality. And if she jumped into a parallel universe, why was she living in the same year as the same person, just minor differences in life?
It's not often that you hear of a ghost inhabiting a radio station, but accounts of this presence go back over decades. More recent accounts of the ghost at CKUA Radio in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, seem to start in 2009 when a summer intern reported a very strange phenomenon. She was working at the station and at the time based in an old building called Alberta Block when her work experience became quite unnerving. The young woman was the only person at work in the dark, dank basement when she suddenly had a distinct feeling that she was not alone. Her job at that time was to catalogue records on a computer which was located in the back corner of the room. Understandably, by the end of the day, she was quite keen to leave both the basement and the building. She switched off the computer and stood up, then crossed the room to retrieve her keys from the place where she'd left them. But her keys were nowhere to be seen. She remembered having placed them near the edge of a desk next to the door, and now they were no longer there. Wondering if maybe they had fallen off the desk, the woman scanned the floor beneath, but the keys were not there either. She then wondered if she had made a mistake and left them somewhere else, even though she was quite certain that she had not. The intern then left the basement to retrace her steps throughout the building, searching every area high and low, but without any success. Finally, she returned to the basement, by now feeling frustrated and annoyed. These feelings turned to shock when she instantly spotted her keys placed near the edge of the desk by the door, exactly where she'd left them. They were positioned precisely where they had not been a short time before, when she was searching. It should be noted that the intern was later described by CKUA then Chief Executive Officer Ken Regan as being very intelligent and not easily scared. However, another incident occurred soon after that when she was again working alone in the basement. She had again left her keys in the same place on the same desk, supposing that surely there was no reason anything strange would happen to them again. However, this supposition was proven wrong when, as she worked at the computer, the keys actually flew off the table and crashed to the floor with a clatter. She immediately spun around, but there was no one present, no one visible at any rate. She shouted out to the empty room, "Stop it!" and her angry outburst worked. She never again had an encounter with the resident ghost of Alberta Block. The spirit is believed to be a former employee of CKUA Radio who seems unable to move on. The Alberta Block building was headquarters for the broadcaster between 1955 and 2012, and since late last century, many believe a ghost named Sam haunted the building. Even after the station moved to new premises in 2012, it's believed that Sam's spirit remained attached to the location and refused to move on. Sam was a man who passed away in the 1970s. He was the building's caretaker, whom co-workers later described as polite, quiet, and perhaps eccentric. The pipe-smoking, opera-loving caretaker is said to have passed of a heart attack in a dark corner of the basement, his favourite napping spot. However, it's reported that months, years and decades after the sad incident, people working late at CKUA or around the building would hear someone singing opera or smell cigar smoke in an area where there were no other people. Sam was described as a big man who was said to never laugh, although he enjoyed singing while he swept the floors and was known to have smoked a pipe or cigar at all hours of the day. His placid demeanour was said to have hidden a checkered past, wherein it was rumoured that Sam had had ties to a terrorist group and was even said to have once threatened the life of the Alberta Premier, Ernest Manning. Apparently convicted for this crime, Sam had been forced to undergo lobotomy, a surgical procedure that reduces connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. The past events of his life may have explained why Sam's co-workers found him to be very quiet and even strange in his behaviour. Unnervingly, after Sam's passing in the 1970s, some staff still heard him singing opera from across empty rooms. As with the summer intern, many other employees have sensed unseen eyes observing them from the shadows, particularly when down in the basement. One night, a tape machine malfunctioned and a technician named Larry King had to remove it to the basement in order to repair it. The tape machine was large, heavy, and awkward to carry, and as he struggled down the staircase, Larry was suddenly overwhelmed with an odd but certain awareness that he was not alone. His skin felt prickly, and a shiver chilled his spine as he hesitated and glanced around. When he was persuaded that there was no one within sight, he continued, and once he had reached the base of the stairs, he turned around and started to nudge the crash bar with his hip so as to push the door open without using his hands. But as he started to do so, the door flew open all by itself, and Larry nearly fell to the floor. He was able to regain his balance, but if he had fallen, the tape machine would have landed on top and crushed him. In this instance, some credit could be given to the ethereal Sam for attempting to help. There have also been eerie sightings of Sam. In another strange incident, Bill Cool, who had been a long-time employee of the radio station, was working in the control room an hour after midnight. Bill was alone, but of course had that sinking sensation that he wasn't. Definitely sensing a presence, when he happened to glance at the control room window, he saw the reflection of a face that was not his own. Although the lighting was dim, Bill could clearly make out a pair of eyes and glistening white teeth with a cigar clenched between them. It appeared that someone was standing directly behind him, but when Bill quickly spun around, there was no one there. When he looked back at the glass again, the reflected apparition was gone. Another sighting was reported just before Christmas in 1997. CKUA radio DJ Lark Clark was working alone in the Alberta Block building late one Saturday night. She heard footsteps advancing down the narrow hallway towards the broadcast booth and wondered who on earth it could be. Her back was turned to the hallway door, and in front of her was the microphone, broadcast control board, and a glass wall. She said she was mid-sentence on live radio when suddenly a silvery glow reflected off the glass wall, seeming to hover over her shoulder. With a shock, she observed in that silvery light a profile of a man's face and head moving along outside the window behind her. She later remembered the terror she felt as the face and footsteps faded away down the long, narrow hallway, as she even thought of calling out to the audience with a request to call 911. She then thought, who do they call? Ghostbusters. Ken Regan heard numerous stories during his years at CKUA about staff encounters with Sam and the ghost's notoriety for playing tricks on them, such as we've seen, taking keys, then returning them to the same spot a few hours later. Another annoying prank was turning on the taps in the bathroom just as people were walking out. Regan has said that people whom he greatly respected and trusted, and whom he knew would not invent these kinds of stories, have told him of their experiences with Sam. The ghost was widely perceived and notorious. Chris Martin, another former DJ at the station during the 90s, recalled that not long after he started, people started asking him, "Have you seen the ghost yet?" Sam's spirit appears to have stuck around well after CKUA ceased broadcasting from Alberta Block, where, according to employees, he roamed the halls over decades. The station even brought in the Alberta Paranormal Investigators Society in 2009 and staggeringly found that Sam may not even be the only spirit haunting the building. After spending the night in the basement, where they performed tests using electromagnetic meters and night vision cameras, a sound the team did record was what they believed to be the voices of two little girls singing. The strange words they sang were, "Go back, go all the way back." Sam's spirit seems to have eluded the investigators. After CKUA's move to new premises, Regan said that the station extended an open invitation to Sam's ghost to join them. But, as far as he knows, no incidents have ever been reported at the new building.
Many people around the world have seen UFOs, and many claim to have been abducted, and Australia is no exception. Australia has a huge landmass where people drive vast distances. It is no wonder that the outback of Australia would be the perfect place to be visited or even abducted by aliens. The following are 3 classic cases of abductions or attempted abductions. The blue light. On the 30th of October 1967, a man by the name of Harris travelled around the Western Australian outback as a wool grader, and on one particular night he had just finished paying off his shearers at an outpost near Mallee. Mallee is in the southwest of the state and 3 hours from Perth, the capital of Western Australia. Harris was heading to the town of Boyup Brook, which was a 50-minute drive from Mallee. He was driving on a deserted stretch of road when all of a sudden he found the electrics in his car had completely cut out. He said that he had no feeling of deceleration and his car had come to an abrupt halt. Everything around him became deathly quiet, and then a beam of blue light flooded the car. He looked out of his window, and above the vehicle was an oval-shaped object, and he had the strangest sensation that it was being watched. All of a sudden, the light disappeared and the engine immediately started. Again, Harris had no sensation of acceleration, and he found himself speeding down the road again. It was as if he'd been frozen in time. He later checked his watch, which he considered to be extremely accurate, and found he'd lost several minutes. Furthermore, 2 weeks following the incident, he complained of a constant headache. Believing he was ill, he went to the doctor, who referred him to a specialist in Perth. A team of doctors searched for evidence of temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause brief lapses of consciousness, but they found nothing wrong with him. In 1967, they did not practice regressive hypnosis, at least not in Australia, but a strange experience on the road and his lost time bears the classic hallmarks of an alien abduction, and it would be interesting to know if Harris suffered from disturbing dreams. The humming. On September the 27th, 1974, a 19-year-old man and an 11-year-old boy were hunting in the snowy mountains in southern New South Wales, Australia, when they saw a large white light on the horizon. The light was giving off a low humming sound, then everything around them became deadly quiet. That was all they could remember of the incident. There was no regressive therapy used on them, but 9 years later, the young boy, now 20 years old, claims to have developed psychic powers. He then started to have strange dreams, where he began to relive the events from 9 years ago. In his dreams, he sees himself being pulled towards the humming object, then he is floating inside the object before being placed on a table surrounded by tall, thin grey alien-type beings that proceeded to attach instruments to him and test his reactions. He looked across at the 19-year-old man who appeared to be struggling with the beings and had to be drugged. Like many other abductions, the aliens then showed him images of a devastating landscape, which he believed was Earth. Throughout the ordeal, he said he never remembered being afraid. Nullarbor Nightmare. The following story was initially reported as a story of the century, and given its details, it could very well have been. In the early hours of January the 20th, 1988, the Knowles family was driving along the remote Nullarbor Plane in Australia. The Nullarbor Plane is a flat, almost treeless, semi-arid road in southern Australia, located on the Great Australian Bight Coast with the Great Victoria Desert to its north. The Nullarbor Plane stretches about 1,100 kilometres from east to west across the border between Western Australia and South Australia. The Knowles family were driving from Perth in Western Australia to Melbourne in Victoria. The family were about 13 hours into their journey towards Melbourne. The long mundane journey along the air highway suddenly turned to terror when their vehicle came under attack from an unidentified flying object that proceeded to torment them for 90 minutes and was described as a large glowing object. The mother said that she first saw a glowing object in the rear window at about 2:45 a.m. The family were Faye Knowles and her 3 sons, Patrick, Wayne and Sean, and 2 dogs. The family claimed they were driving down the road when something landed on the roof of their small 1984 Ford Telstra sedan. After the thump on the roof, the mother reached outside to feel around and found something spongy or rubbery before they were lifted into the air. The car was then violently shaken before it was forced back onto the road, causing one of the tyres to blow out. Badly shaken, the driver, Sean, put his foot on the accelerator as his mother screamed. Family members claimed that as this was taking place, the voices became distorted and time appeared to slow down. Sean said that he then wound down the window and felt this thing on the roof, and smoke started coming into the car, and they later found that the car was covered in black stuff. Fearing for their lives, they quickly stopped the car and hid behind a small tree and bushes, hoping they would not be found, as they believed the object was searching for them. After about 50 minutes, they returned to the car, changed the tyre and continued their journey without further incident, and drove on to Ceduna in South Australia and reported their horrific ordeal to the police. The police took their story seriously and, on inspecting their car, found that it had a dented roof and was covered in black dust. It is interesting to note that the soil on the Nullarbor Plane is an orange colour, and the family described the object as egg cup shaped. Apparently, they were not the only people to experience a UFO attack, where approximately 80 kilometres south, the crew of a tuna fishing boat claimed that they were buzzed by an unidentified flying object barely minutes after the family were accosted. The crew claimed that their voices also became distorted as the object was buzzing them. Sergeant Jim Fennell of Ceduna Police took all reports seriously. He said the crew of the tuna boat could not have known about the Knowles experience when they had reported UFO sighting in the Great Australian Bight, a body of water off the Australian coast. Forensic scientists later examined a black powdery ash both inside and outside the vehicle. A spokesman at the Royal Australian Air Force Base in Edinburgh in South Australia said he was not aware of any military aircraft in the area at the time. 36 hours after it happened, the family was interviewed on the evening news and gave the following story. The family claimed that the object was behind them and then appeared in front of them, and at one stage was on the ground. It then proceeded to follow them. They were asked what happened when it landed on the roof of the car. They said that they were screaming and yelling, and there was a humming sound. Sean said that when it was on the roof, he rolled down his window and smoke started coming in. It was like a greyish black mist. We were terrified. "27-year-old Maureen Puddy lived in Rye, a seaside town on the Mornington Peninsula in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, approximately 63 kilometres southwest of Melbourne. In 1972, her 7-year-old son was involved in an accident which had injured his leg and had to be taken by air ambulance to the Austin Hospital in Heidelberg, northeast of Melbourne, a distance of 102 kilometres from Rye. On the evening of July the 5th, Maureen was driving along the Murdoch Road and was on her way home from visiting her son in the hospital, and between the coastal towns of Dromana and Frankston, she spotted a blue light in the sky that seemed to be following her. At first she thought it was an air ambulance and stopped the car to get a better look at it, but on closer inspection could see that it was not a helicopter. As it drew closer, to her surprise, found she was looking at a giant object that was shaped like two saucers on top of one another and about 30.5 metres in diameter. It had no portals or joins and looked very smooth. The object made a low humming sound with a blue light that glowed all over. It appeared to hover about 12 metres above the ground. Maureen quickly jumped back into her car and drove away, but the object appeared to chase her for the next 48 kilometres down the deserted road before shooting off into the distance. She was so concerned that she reported the incident to the police at Dromana. At 9:15 p.m. on the 25th of July 1972, she was driving along the same stretch of road after again visiting her son in hospital and spotted the same blue light, but on this occasion the engine of a Holden car suddenly died and she was unable to drive away to escape. The car was no longer in her control and it was dragged onto the grass verge on the side of the road. The object was now hovering directly above the car, where she and the car were now totally bathed in blue light, and she felt she was in the middle of a vacuum where it was perfectly still and perfectly quiet. It was this moment when she felt a telepathic message being beamed down onto her. She then heard a voice in her head, which initially sounded like it was translating in a foreign tongue. The voice said, "All your tests will be negative." She had no idea what this meant. It then said, "Tell the media and do not panic. We mean no harm." It then said, "You now have control." Maureen then restarted the car and continued on the journey, and the blue light and the feeling of being in a vacuum vanished. After the unusual encounter, she again reported the incident to the police, who she felt had not believed her story. Maureen then contacted the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Laverton, just outside Melbourne. They checked all records on whether any unusual craft or weather balloons had been in the area that night, but told her there was nothing in the sky at that date or time. Maureen attempted to contact the media with her story without any luck. She then decided to contact Judith McGee from the Victorian UFO Research Society. McGee was able to tell her that she was not the only person to witness a strange sighting. Another unusual sighting had also been seen and reported in the sky that night. A 21-year-old engineering manager by the name of Maris Ezegelis reported seeing a blue streak of light coming from the nearby suburb of Mount Waverley. Ezegelis had described it as having an unusually broad meteor trail and was travelling horizontally. When Maureen Putty heard that someone else had witnessed it, she became excited, as on her very first encounter, she had also witnessed a broad blue streak of light that had followed her and hovered above her car. She was now feeling reassured that she was not going crazy. However, Ezegelis had witnessed a blue streak of light at 10 p.m, which means that on her first encounter with the object, Maureen had somehow lost 45 minutes that she was unable to account for. Maureen was also concerned that the alien voice had asked her to speak to the media, and if she did not do what they asked, they may come back. On February the 22nd, 1973, they did return as Maureen was doing the housework. She heard a voice say, "Maureen, come to the meeting place." She first thought that someone was at the front door, but there was nobody there. Throughout the day, she continued to hear the voice over and over. She eventually came to the conclusion that the aliens were using telepathy to plant the voice in her head, and it was obvious that the aliens wanted to talk with her again. Not wishing to meet with the aliens alone, she again contacted UFO investigator Judith McGee along with a colleague called Paul Norman, and they were to make their way to where Maureen's car was dragged onto the grass verge on Murdoch Road at 8:30 p.m. When Judith McGee first got into Maureen's car, she said she felt a tingling sensation, not unlike a mild electric shock. On the way to Murdoch Road, Maureen told the investigators that a figure in a silvery suit had suddenly materialised in the back seat before Judith and Paul had got into the car, but had abruptly vanished. When they reached their destination, the being in the silvery suited figure reappeared, but this time it was standing on the outside of the car. Again, the two investigators could see nothing. Paul Norman even got out of the car and stood in the exact spot where Maureen claimed the alien was standing. Maureen said that the figure had stepped back to allow Paul Norman to occupy that spot, but the alien then walked away behind some bushes. It was obvious that Maureen was attuned to seeing the alien where the others could not. Why did it not want the others to see it? Maureen then said that the alien figure had then gestured to her to follow him. Judith offered to accompany her, but Maureen gripped the steering wheel tightly, stating that she was not going anywhere. It was at this stage that Maureen Putty announced that she was being abducted. As the two investigators were looking at Maureen, she began to describe the inside of the UFO and that the beings inside had kidnapped her. She then screamed, "I can't get out, and there are no doors or windows," not realising as she was still sitting next to Judith in the car. The alien then pointed to a strange mushroom in the room, and inside the mushroom was a jelly-like substance that moved about. She said, "He wants me to close my eyes." Maureen then fell into a hypnotic trance, but continued to describe the inside of the ship. Fortunately for Maureen, the trance-like state did not last long, and Maureen said, "He's gone. I can tell that he's gone because it feels different." It took until 1983 for Judith McGee to write up the strange incident in a magazine called the Flying Saucer Review. Although Maureen Putty had not actually disappeared from view throughout her abduction, Judith was convinced that Maureen had not concocted her ordeal and had been genuinely upset by her terrifying experience. Maureen Putty later gave a talk organised by the UFO Society about her ordeal to a crowded room, who were intrigued by her experience, so much so that throughout the talk the room was deathly silent.
In his research into the haunted history of the United States, paranormal historian M.J. Wayland uncovered several old accounts of hauntings seemingly well known within families, down generations. Here are two of those occurrences from the late 19th century known to predict a terrible outcome. The journalist reporting a news item in Lippincott's monthly magazine wrote that he heard this account firsthand from the youngest daughter of a farmer he called Mr. G. In 1844, the successful farmer, his wife and daughter were living in Iowa. Most of the children from the G's large family had left home, and their remaining daughter was aged 18. It was early evening one summer when the farmhands were gathered to complete milking of the cows. The farmer was close by feeding the pigs, while his daughter assisted the milkmaids. At that stage, not all the cows had been herded into the yard, but were grouped outside near the public road, which was safe as the rural area was very quiet. However, suddenly a startling clamour erupted, as of a massive wagon being furiously driven and rapidly approaching the peaceful scene. Frighteningly, the pounding of the horses' hooves and clunking of the wagon wheels were distinctly heard to advance closer and closer. Mr. G shouted out to the farmhands to get off the road, as it sounded like some kind of runaway vehicle was approaching. All present rapidly retreated to the side of the road, even though nothing could as yet be seen, not even a dust cloud. However, the unsettling sounds continued to advance with increasing speed and noise until they seemed to have reached the shocked group. By this stage, the cows were showing unmistakable dread, throwing their heads back with terrified bellowing and galloping off into the nearby woods. The pigs were frantically running around inside their pen, squealing in fright. All the humans present stood wide-eyed and visibly drained, suddenly aware and in dread of the invisible threat. Having arrived at the farm, the clamorous and chaotic presence turned and seemed to pass through the fence, which sounded like it was collapsing, although it remained intact. The noise crossed the yard and struck against the pig pen fence within only a few feet of Mr. G, who stumbled back and fell into the dirt. Then, almost as if it was satisfied with its work, the clamour abruptly turned again and rushed through another fence, then down an unused timber road, before gradually fading into the distance. Meanwhile, Mrs. G had heard the disturbance and came running from the house, demanding to know what had happened and which cattle had gone missing. When told that the group present had seen nothing, she visibly blanched and shrieked the eerie question, "Which one of us does it mean?" Mrs. G espoused a conviction that her family always experienced some kind of warning of an impending death, even though neither her husband nor daughter were of the same belief. As soon as she found out that the ghostly occurrence seemed to have been targeting her own husband, she became convinced that Mr. G would be the next to go. She was not mistaken in her agonised conclusion, as only 10 days later he met with a fatal accident while helping to dig a well on his land. He had been caught in an earth cave-in and succumbed to his terrible injuries. Another chilling account of an ominous portent was sourced by Wayland as having occurred in Reeds Hill, Massachusetts. This phenomenon, which became known as the ghost clock, was investigated by a daily newspaper, the Boston Evening Transcript, in January 1898. A woman called Mrs. Pittman had reported the mysterious power of a gutted clock that had started to tick. According to the article, the clock had been examined by thousands of skeptics over the years, people including clergymen, scientists, and clock experts, but all of them had left convinced that there was no trick or deception involved, and awestruck by the perplexing phenomenon. The outdated old clock was described as comprising a simple wooden case with nothing inside it but a piece of coiled wire which had once been part of the mechanism. Mrs. Pittman claimed that its original owner was her father, but that even when it had been in his possession, it lacked both a pendulum and any inner workings. She said that, for whatever reason, he had greatly treasured the clock and kept it on the mantelpiece of a little-used room on the second floor of their house. The newspaper article decried any kind of superstitious or spiritualist bent pertaining to Mrs. Pittman and her husband. They were church-going people with no reputation for belief in the supernatural. However, Mrs. Pittman reported that when she was younger, one evening she had heard very clearly the clock strike, as if it were in perfect working order. When the strokes ended, she had turned to her father with a querying amazement. He in turn had replied, "The clock is striking for me. It means that I am going away." At the time, the young woman had given a sceptical laugh, but her father repeated his claim. He was going away and would never return. In sudden and unexplained circumstances, he did in fact pass away only a few days after that. Mrs. Pittman had forgotten her father's odd statement until some time later, when, mysteriously, the clock began to tick, giving every indication that it was now in full working order. She called her brother, who was equally bemused by the sudden unexplained activation, seemingly of an invisible pendulum powered by an invisible mechanism and with no obvious explanation of what was creating the sounds. Not believing his late father's claim that the clock's activity was an omen of impending tragedy, the brother brought in multiple clockmakers to investigate the source of the unexplained ticking. However, after weeks of analysis, the horologists were still unable to account for the eerie tick-tock coming from within the case. With a sudden awareness that her father's ghost might be causing the phenomenon, Mrs. Pittman quickly found that the clock was able to answer simple yes-no questions, and that its responses were always rational and accurate in predicting the future. The transcript reported that she had now opened her house to visitors wishing to communicate with deceased loved ones, with ostensibly their relative spirits answering their questions. Through Mrs. Pittman's mediumship, many consulted the clock and were seen to have received satisfactory information. It was reported that when visitors were musical, there could even be heard a tinkling like disembodied fingers plucking on the wire, and one astonished woman even heard the opening notes of a tune that had been a favourite of her recently deceased loved one. The mysterious aspect of both of these strange occurrences is that in each case, an older member of the family knew about the haunting phenomenon and its terrible meaning.
On Thursday the 16th of July 1981, three young women, Viv Hayward 27, Valerie Walter 26 and Rosemary Hawkins 20, were enjoying their weekly night out at Tiffany's nightclub in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, Western England. They left Tiffany's at 2 a.m. for the 24-minute drive back to their homes in Telford, which was a distance of about 15 miles. The route they took was on the A5 and through the village of Atcham. Whilst driving, all the women suddenly became quiet and stopped talking as they looked across some fields and spotted some lights, two white and two red. Rosemary Hawkins then wound down the window to get a better view of the lights and could see that they were attached to some sort of object. At this stage, the women were more curious than concerned. That is, until it started to follow them. Valerie Walter looked out of the rear window and noticed that the strange object had windows along its side, and there were lights on its underside that seemed to tilt towards the car. It was now 2:10 a.m, and they were about 10 minutes from home when Viv Hayward attempted to put her foot hard on the accelerator, but the engine failed to respond, and it began to splutter. It was when the engine started to lose power that the three women began to panic. They were extremely fearful of their car breaking down in the middle of a deserted road in the early hours, whilst an unusual object appeared to stalk them. All of a sudden, the object vanished behind some clouds, and miraculously the car engine regained power. They were able to continue their journey home. However, the three young women were convinced that they'd just encountered an unidentified flying object. When they arrived in their hometown of Telford, they went straight to the Mallingsgate police station to report their sighting. The women claimed to have arrived at the police station at around 2:40 a.m, but police records showed they'd actually arrived at the station at around 3 a.m. If the police records were accurate, the women could not account for 20 minutes of their journey. The young women later underwent hypnotic regression, where Viv Haywood recalled where everything went very quiet when the engine failed and she had the feeling that she was floating. The car was then lifted from the road and disappeared under a white cloud. When this was taking place, she said she was alone in the car as it was lifted vertically into the UFO and went between two large doors that had opened up on the underside of the object. Suddenly, two small hairless beings with large eyes and wearing green cloaks took her out of the car and placed her in a reclining chair that looked like a dentist chair, where they held her down. She said the aliens were very strong and wanted to discover things about her and how humans were made. The aliens had strange robot-like voices. They told her not to be afraid, and she felt they were taking something from her body, and she could feel them pulling on her bones, which was extremely painful, and she cried out. They just repeated, "Do not be afraid." They then further examined her body and scanned it with a big light which left her paralysed, and she had to be lifted back into the car. The next thing Viv Haywood remembered was driving along the road again, and the UFO had vanished. It was then the youngest of the women, Rosemary Hawkins' turn to be regressed, where she too remembered everything going very quiet, and she too had the sensation of floating, but she had not been in the car. This statement coincided with what Viv Haywood had said. Rosemary found herself alone in a room with a table on it and was terrified. She had no idea what she was doing there or how she got there, but had a strange compulsion to get on the table. Then a number of robot-like creatures entered the room, who appeared to be about 4 feet tall. They were round on top with a round body and round leg, and were not unlike R2-D2 from Star Wars. However, they'd not given her a full medical examination, but appeared to be curious and just wanted to look. Rosemary Hawkins had the feeling she was in an area that led off to a larger room and was waiting for her other two friends. When it was Valerie Walters' turn to be regressed, her story was slightly different. She said the UFO had come at them where its lights were blinding and she felt dizzy. She remembered being in the car with Viv Haywood, but Rosemary Hawkins was missing. She seemed to have been mysteriously beamed out of the car. She recalled the car coming to a sudden halt and the doors were open, so she got out of the car to look for the others. She then remembers floating into a room where two aliens then entered, one male and one female. These were different from the aliens Viv Haywood had described, as they were about 6 feet tall with white skin, blue eyes and long dark hair. The only similarity with Viv Haywood's description is that they were also wearing long green cloaks. She felt they were fascinated by her clothing and was told that the women had been abducted for the purpose of observation. Where Viv Haywood was given a full medical examination, they seemed more interested in Hawkins' clothing. The female alien had even taken off Hawkins' high-heel shoes and then tried them on, but had difficulty walking in them. It appears that Valerie Walters was the only one that questioned the aliens, but that had not got her very far. She had asked them who they were, but they rudely responded by saying she was not to know and she would not understand. Valerie Walters later came to believe that her encounter with the strange beings had not been as benign as she had first recalled. She felt they'd done something to her that was gynecological in nature. About 4 days after that incident, another almost identical case occurred in the same location. A man known only as Tom was travelling along the same point of the A5 road as the three young women. Suddenly, a very large light lit up the sky and an object appeared to float above the treetops. Tom described the craft as looking like a double-decker bus, all illuminated. It remained motionless for some time. Then, a blue light emerged from the underside of the craft. It reached towards the ground, turning a shade of green as it did so. The next thing he knew, the craft was speeding out of sight at an electrifying pace. It was then he realised that he'd lost 3 hours. Since 1989, thousands of people have reported seeing mysterious lights and shapes in the skies over Brussels, Belgium, where most of the descriptions were similar. That the object was triangular, with 3 bright white lights in each corner. The object was flying very low, and there was a flashing red light in the middle, and the 3 white lights appeared to form an equilateral triangle. The witnessing of UFOs began on November the 29th, 1989, near the small town of Eupen, Belgium, and close to the German border. 2 gendarmes by the name of Henri Nicole and Hubert von Montigny were out on a routine patrol, and the 2 officers described the following. As we approached the crossroads at Neuves Road, our attention was drawn to an unusual sight. We saw a field near the road that was all lit up. It was like the lights on a huge football field. We thought it was strange, and we wanted to know what was causing those lights. There was a huge triangular platform, and underneath it were strong headlights. And in the middle was this blinking, pulsating orange light. The whole thing was floating in the air. The gendarmes immediately called their dispatcher, Albert Crutzen. Crutzen claims that the 2 officers told him that they were seeing a strange object in the sky. It made no noise. He said they joked about it and said it might be Santa Claus trying to land. Kreutz duly noted the unusual report in his log, but was highly sceptical. Officer Heinrich and his partner proceeded to follow the object as it flew across the Belgian countryside towards Eupen and described the following. We could see it clearly because the headlights were very strong. We could also see the flickering orange ball underneath. We were driving very slowly because it seemed like there was someone in that object and that somebody was trying to observe what was happening on Earth. All of a sudden, a bright light flashed across the window of Kreutz's office as he described what happened next. Off in the distance, I could see something bright, but I didn't know what it was. Suddenly, I saw something that looked like a laser beam shoot out. Officers Heinrich and von Martini continued to follow the strange silent object, stating, "We continued to observe the object as it circled over the city of Eupen. It appeared to be heading towards the forest. On each side of the object there was a kind of laser beam and a ball that was leaving the object and coming back as if the ball was to measure something, so it was easy for us to keep track of it in the sky." Dispatcher Kreutz sought clarification by contacting 4 local airports, and each airport reported no unusual activity. The 2 gendarmes watched the object for at least 30 minutes as it continued to hover in the distance. Officer Heinrich then claimed that all of a sudden another spacecraft came out of nowhere and claimed they were now a little frightened. Not only was the original object still hovering in the distance, but now a second object began to rise up into the sky and began to tilt slightly. This second object was triangular shaped with bright headlights and had what appeared to be a dome on the top of 2 or 3 small windows. The object was also lit up on the inside. By the time they realized what the object actually was, it flew away. It was what happened next that turned dispatcher Albert Kreutz into a believer and described the following. Through the open window I saw a strange machine floating about 500 feet away from me. It looked like a large ship floating in the air. It drifted in front of me for a few seconds, then flew away in the direction of La Calamine. It was a beautiful thing to see. A few minutes later, 2 other gendarmes reported seeing a similar object over the village of La Calamine, 8 miles to the north. One of the officers, Dieter Plumans, had no doubts about what he saw and described the following. We had heard our colleagues talking about this flying object. In the beginning we thought it was some sort of joke, but then we saw something. It wasn't funny anymore. Both of us had a strange feeling. It was impossible to explain what the object was. We thought it was an American airplane or something. We had no other explanation for what it might be, but it was real, and it was above us. All 4 sightings occurred over a period of 1 hour, within 20 miles of each other. The same day, 11 other gendarmes and more than 100 private citizens came forward with similar reports of UFOs over Belgium. Then, in April 1990, an actual photograph of the object had been taken, showing the same array of lights described by the eyewitnesses. Authorities managed to enhance the film's contrast, clearly showing a triangular shape and the first photographic evidence that UFOs had appeared over the skies above Belgium. Because there were so many reported sightings, the Belgian authorities employed an organisation called SOBEPS, Belgian Society for the Study of Space Phenomena. SOBEPS were to coordinate the many reports and set up certain procedures when dealing with the possibility of future UFO encounters. Almost immediately, Captain Jacques Pinson of the Gendarmerie was called to a home on the outskirts of Brussels where dinner guests reported seeing strange lights in the sky. They said these points of light were very different from the other stars. They were much bigger and much brighter and not the colour of stars. The main colours were reddish or yellow and the others were green. Later, they began to travel short distances in an erratic manner. Meanwhile, NATO's radar tracking station had detected an unknown object at the very same location. Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Billen reported that the object showed up as a small circle with a tail in the lower left quadrant on the radar screen. He stated, "We found other civilian and military radar sites like Semmelzog, Virton, St. Hubert, and they had precisely the same echo at the same place. We were unable to identify this echo as being either enemy or friendly. It was not very clear for us that there was an aircraft." After 4 other radar stations had confirmed the same sighting, the Belgian Air Force immediately deployed 2 F-16s, and the mission was to locate and identify the objects. It did not take long for the pilots to lock onto the object with their onboard radar, but in an instant the object had shot out of range at an incredible rate of speed. Meanwhile, back on the ground, Air Force Major General W.J.L. de Bruer, now totally perplexed, was at a complete loss to explain the encounter, stating, "We measured some exceptional accelerations which cannot be related to conventional aircraft, that is clear." For the next hour, the object appeared to be toying with the pilots and seemed to be playing cat and mouse with them. Whatever the object was, there was no doubt that it had superior technology. Lieutenant Colonel Billen claimed that each time the pilots locked onto the object, it would quickly shoot out of range. He stated, "The pilots confirmed that it was impossible for them to accelerate as quickly as the target was doing." Later that night, when the radar footage was analysed, the object could be seen climbing from 7,000 feet to 10,000 feet in a matter of seconds. Then in an instant, it would plummet 500 feet in 5 seconds, before accelerating more than 1,000 miles per hour. They calculated that it was 1.5 times the speed of sound. No human pilot would survive the combination of acceleration and descent. What further baffled them was, how was the craft able to exceed the speed of sound without them hearing a sonic boom? Major General de Bruer said that no known aircraft was capable of such acrobatics, stating, "The data then on all these performances which were registered during the lock-in on the radar was totally outside of the normal performance envelope of any airplane." Even though skeptics continued to question the sighting, Gendarme Henri Nicole stated that he knows what he witnessed, stating, "Some people don't believe us and the things we have seen. Well, they're afraid to believe us. It doesn't matter to me, but I have seen something, and what else can I say? It was not some invention of my mind. I saw it and it was real, and it happened just as I have said." Major General de Bruer claimed that conventional aircraft were no match for the advanced technology his jet fighters encountered, stating, "I think it's our job to try to find out if there is really something in the air, where it comes from, what the origin is, and what the intentions are. Indeed, there is something going on in Belgium which is beyond our control." The following incident took place in 1974 in a small town called Langenburg in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. The town is located around 8 miles west of the Manitoba border and about 130 miles north of North Dakota. Langenburg is a flat and open prairie and is known for its wheat production. Most of the residents in the locality are all farmers or other agricultural workers. Between midnight on Saturday, August the 31st and 3 a.m. on Sunday the 1st of September 1974, in a typical rainy autumn weather, a babysitter was in a farmhouse and became disturbed by the sounds of dogs barking and growling outside. The babysitter was concerned because the dogs were normally quiet and passive, and she feared that something or somebody was prowling around outside. The nearest farmhouse to the property was owned by the Fuhr family, and the following morning around 10 a.m, the family were preparing to go to church, except for the father, Edwin Fuhr, who had to attend to chores around the farm. As the family were leaving for church, Edwin had jumped on a tractor and headed to the field, as he was preparing to harvest the rapeseed crop. The field was located about 1,500 feet from their farmhouse and 5.5 miles from Langenburg. He'd been operating his tractor for about 1 hour and was approaching a wetland, where he then slowed down to check his position. He could see that he was about 75 feet from the wetland and had to stop the tractor as the ground was becoming too soft. As Edwin was looking around, he spotted what looked like a dome-shaped object about 50 feet away from him, and at first believed it must have been a metal goose blind that hunters use for duck hunting. He then figured his neighbour was playing a joke on him, so he figured he'd creep up to the object and scare him instead. He then jumped off of his tractor and slowly walked up to the object, and as he got to around 15 feet, he noticed that the grass around it was moving, and he was close enough to see that the object was spinning at high speed. Now extremely hesitant, he quickly backed away from the object and did not take his eyes off it until he reached his tractor. As he climbed aboard his tractor, he now had a better vantage point and was shocked to find that there was not just one spinning object, but 4 other similar objects to the left of the tractor. Edwin Fuhr was now frozen in fear and was so terrified he could not move, and not knowing what to do, sat there for around 20 minutes. While sitting on his tractor, he could only stare at the 5 spinning objects, who all appeared to be hovering and were about 18 inches above the ground, and all were arranged in an arc around the wetland. As he studied them closer, he observed that they appeared to be metal-like brushed stainless steel. The domes themselves had darker grooves and were dark grey, like they'd been hot but were now cooling down, but no other surface details were visible. Each of the objects were around 5 feet in height and about 11 feet in diameter. Each disc had a bottom lip that was a different shade to the rest of the body. One of the discs was more active than the other 4, and Edwin could not work out what was happening, but then saw what looked like a small probe extending out of the object onto the grass. Still frightened, he attempted to put the tractor into gear and get away from the object, but found he could not move the throttle or the steering wheel. He could not work out whether the tractor was generally inoperable or whether he was so panicked that fear had removed all of his strength. Not knowing what move to make next, the objects one by one suddenly rose in the air in a step formation, where the closest object to where he was seated appeared to lead the others. The objects rose in the air and suddenly stopped when they were about 200 feet above the ground. The whole operation was done in a split second. If you'd blinked, you'd have missed the takeoff, but they abruptly stopped in the sky. As Edwin continued to look up in amazement, he saw a grey vapour shoot out from the underside of each object, followed by a strong downward blast of wind, and the pressure from the blast caused the grass and crop around Edwin and the tractor to flatten, resulting in him having to grab his hat to stop it blowing off of his head. Edwin Fuhr then thought, well, there goes my crop. The objects remained in the air for several minutes, then ascended further into the clouds before vanishing. Still in total shock, Edwin just sat in his tractor, waiting for them to return, and when they did not come back, he jumped off of his tractor and walked towards where the objects had been. As he walked around, he found 5 rings of compressed grass that swirled in a clockwise direction, but fortunately were not dead and did not appear to have heated or charred in any way. Inside one of the rings were probe marks where the grass was laid flat in 3-foot-long strips, leading away from the ring on one side. In the silence, he could hear the distant sounds of cattle that seemed agitated in a neighbour's field. When he later spoke to the neighbour, he was told that the cattle had been so disturbed that they'd actually broken the fence in 3 places to escape. After the strange and terrifying episode, Edwin continued with his farming, while at the same time mulling over in his mind what had happened to him that morning. When his family returned from church, they found Edwin extremely worked up and was not eating, claiming he was not hungry. After they questioned him about his loss of appetite, he finally came clean and told his family what he'd seen that morning. He then grabbed the stainless steel bowl and turned it over onto the table, stating that is what it looked like. His family found it hard to believe his story, so he took them out to the location where everything had taken place. His father was amazed at the marks left and spent the afternoon crawling on his hands and knees observing them. They later called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to see if they'd received any eyewitness claims, but they had nothing on their books. However, following day on September the 2nd, their dogs started barking excitedly, and one of the dogs that liked to roam freely throughout the farm refused to go anywhere near where the objects had landed. On September the 3rd, Edwin found a 6th circle in the same formation. And on the evening of September the 14th, the dogs again barked, and the following morning Edwin found a 7th circle on the ground, forming an arc with the other 6 circles. Then additional rings were found near Peebles, Lake Lenore, and Dinsmore, Saskatchewan, where over the next few weeks 15 circles in all were found in wheat fields. An expert was called out to photograph and measure the ring circles and realised that it was not a hoax. All details were then sent to the National Research Council of Canada. A man called Dr. Alan McNamara from the NRC was a skeptic and believed the idea of strange objects was ridiculous and believed the rings on the ground were just fairy rings. A fairy ring is caused by an individual fungus growing underground. However, the rings on Edwin Firth's farm were uncharacteristic of fairy rings, as the rings were uniform in size and geometry and would be untenable in nature. It was later found that there were more circles found in the immediate area and throughout Saskatchewan, and some of these were in cultivated crops. So, what did Edwin Firth encounter in 1974? As there appears no doubt that he came across 5 bowl-shaped objects. Were they controlled by intelligent beings? And if so, why were they there? In 1988, Carol Thomas, 45, and her daughter Helen, 24, from Birmingham, England, worked together at a mill which was close to where they lived. Every workday, Helen would walk to her mother's house and together they would walk to the mill, which was about 50 minutes away. The walk to work took them through various alleyways between houses. However, on one particular morning, on the 30th of March 1988, when it was still fairly dark, they heard a distant humming noise and could not work out where it was coming from. Else it was too early in the morning for the factories to be operating, and at that time of day it was normally very quiet. Suddenly, a bright light shone down from above, like someone was shining a torch on them. They both looked up and the light started to get larger and larger until it was directly above their heads. Both of them were terrified and grabbed hold of each other's hands. All of a sudden they started to feel dizzy, and the next thing they remember was walking along the alleyway in an erratic manner, both dazed and confused. Carol looked at her daughter and could see that her leather raincoat was wet, but it had not been raining. They both knew that something was not quite right, and things got even stranger when they arrived at work. As they arrived at the gate, the security guard told them that they were very late for work. They did not remember much about the rest of the day, and from that day onwards were nervous about the walk to work. After the incident, they both noticed a reddening and blistering of their skin on their arms and faces that looked like sunburn, and they both suffered from nosebleeds and discharge from their navel. Helen was also missing a circular patch of hair from the nape of her neck. Several years after the strange experience, both mother and daughter were still shaken by what they had experienced, especially the lost time on the way to work. They told their story to Tony Dodd, who had served in the North Yorkshire Police Force for 25 years, where he worked as a detective in the Crime Task Force. It was early one morning while serving in the force that he saw a large disc-shaped object whilst driving across the Yorkshire moors. This episode triggered a lifelong interest in UAPs. Using his investigative experience, he went on to become a leading authority on extraterrestrial phenomena. They told Dodd that they were glad they had experienced it together for proof it actually happened. On March 12, 1994, Helen and Carol agreed to undergo hypnosis, which took place in separate rooms so that they could not hear what each was saying. Carol was the first to be hypnotized and was asked to recall the events of that morning in March 1988. She described the usual morning routine up to when they arrived at the alleyway. All of a sudden, they heard a low humming sound, and then a light appeared above them, like a torch shining down, which got larger and larger. Now terrified, they grabbed hold of each other's hands and felt strange. The light was suddenly below them, and they could see what looked like the moon above them, and then were moving towards it. Carol then stopped talking, and when she spoke, she was hesitant and confused, saying, "Where am I?" They were now in a room where everything was white with windows all around it. She's lying on a table and unable to move. She has no clothes on. There appears to be netting over her legs, and it feels wet. She was able to look across and can see her daughter Carol, who is also lying on a table naked with netting over her legs. What are they doing? Helen then described strange beings around the table. They are small, with tiny ears and big black eyes. They are very thin, with 3 long, thin fingers. They are not wearing any clothes, and their skin is white. These beings are standing around the table and her daughter's table. They are touching her stomach, and it feels very cold. They're looking at her hands and feet, and they have a long, thin glass tube which they're pushing into her stomach through her navel, but she's feeling no pain. As the tube is sticking out, they are now looking at her hair and start pulling at it. They're removing the tube, which is full of fluid. She believes they're removing eggs. She's thinking, please don't hurt my daughter. A cup was then placed over her head. She is allowed off the table and taken to a large screen, where one of the beings proceeded to push some buttons where a succession of symbols that included squares, triangles and wavy lines appeared, followed by footage of wars and explosions. Carol described her surroundings where everything appeared wet, and there were beings standing at the back of the room who were tall, unlike the small beings around the table. One of the tall beings has long blonde hair and blue eyes. He is wearing a silver suit with a blue badge showing a circle, a triangle and 2 wavy lines. She then remembered putting her clothes back on and feeling dizzy and disoriented, and back in the alley with her daughter, who was wondering why her jacket was wet. Helen is then hypnotized and described the same scenario of walking down the alleyway, the humming sound followed by bright lights. She describes lying on a table without her clothes and a mother on a table next to her. She then cried and said, "I want my mum." She said she could not move, and there's cloth over her legs and it's wet. She can see them putting an object into her mother's mouth. She said the beings are small with large eyes. They're not wearing any clothes, and their skin appears wrinkly, and they seem to waddle. There is a big camera hanging above her on a long arm. The room is white, with windows all around. The little people are looking at her hands, feet, and mouth, and are touching her stomach. One of them has a thin rod with a silver ball on the end, which she pushes into her nose, but there is no pain. When they remove the rod, the silver ball is missing. They insert wire into her ear and a tube into her navel where they remove fluid. They then place a large cup over her head. They turn her over and examine her back and legs and place what feels like a small circular object on the hair at the bottom of her head. It pulls her hair and she doesn't like it. They turn her over again and are looking at packets of cigarettes that they must have removed from their pockets. She's also taken to a screen and shown images. She's taken to another room and smells burning. They place a small wafer in her mouth, which she spits out. She's taken to another room and sees her mother standing next to a tall, beautiful blonde woman wearing a silver suit and badge. She is given her clothes, and one of the beings is rubbing her leather coat against his face to feel the texture. She's suddenly back in the alleyway with her mother. Under hypnosis, Helen recalls being abducted at 5 and being shown strange-looking children. She is given a small stone, as were the children, and she could hear voices coming from the stone. It turns out that Helen had been abducted many times. Her mother was asked about the stone, and she said yes, she kept it under her bed for years. She did not know where it came from. The abduction of Carol and Helen Thomas bears a striking similarity to many other abduction cases. What do they want? Is it to better the human race or their own race? In autumn 1968, a 38-year-old physician was living in southern France with his wife and 16-month-old son. The doctor had problems on his right side and had a limp after he stepped on a landmine in the Algerian War in 1958. The doctor had recently cut himself above his left ankle while chopping wood, which resulted in severe swelling. The 2 injuries made it painful for him to walk or stand. Around 3:45 a.m. on November the 2nd, the doctor awoke to the sound of his son calling out and went to his room. He found him standing up in his cot and pointing at the window and repeated the words "row," which the doctor identified as baby talk for shiny. Outside the weather was stormy, with strong winds and rain, and what he initially believed was flashes of lightning. Strangely though, after the flashes of lightning, there was no thunder. He stared out of the window at the valley below and found it illuminated by sudden intense flashes of light which were occurring once a second to a distance of about 4 kilometres, but again there was no sound of thunder and he could not see where the light was coming from. He went back downstairs and saw the time was 3:55 a.m. As he poured himself a glass of water, he looked out of the window where the lights continued to flash, but could not see where it was coming from. He then limped to the living room and opened up 2 windows, and by now the rain had stopped, but then observed 2 identical luminous objects about 2 kilometres away in the valley below that were moving east in perfect unison. Each object had a round white spotlight on his underside and looked to be oval in shape with 2 distinct sections. The upper section was luminous and silvery white in colour, and the lower section was the colour of a deep sunset red, and he could see it moving. Each of the objects had 3 rod-like protrusions that looked like antennae, with a vertical one on top that was tapered towards the end, and a straight horizontal one on each side, sticking out from between the 2 layers. The protrusions were about as long as the object was tall, and the same colour as the top, but there was a darker bulge on the underside of the objects where the beams originated. The flashes appeared to be entering back through the antennae, and creating a smaller secondary flash between the UFOs that seemed to be reacting with the atmosphere around it. The UFOs then slowly turned north towards the Doctor, while at the same time drifted closer to each other until they eventually came together, forming a single beam. Then the 2 inner protrusions touched and the flashing stopped, but continued to move and then merged together, forming a single object. The object then flew straight towards the Doctor before abruptly stopping just 200 metres away. Now closer, the Doctor could see that the lower reddish half glowed incandescently, like it was lit from the inside, and was divided into 11 sections by vertical lines. 5 of the sections were dark red horizontal lines, moving from top to bottom every 4 seconds, but each at different times, and he watched it for several minutes. The Doctor was terrified but transfixed before it tilted in the sky, showing its round underside. It was now beaming its spotlight directly at the Doctor, followed by a loud bang before dematerialising, resulting in a fluffy white cloud that slowly dissipated in the breeze, and then a fine white luminous thread flew several hundred metres into the sky. As the Doctor looked up, he saw a shining white dot which quickly vanished with a sudden bang, and the UFO was gone. In a state of shock, the Doctor checked the kitchen clock that showed 4:05 a.m. The Doctor immediately began to take notes and drew sketches of the UFO before waking his wife. One of the first things that she noticed was that her husband was now walking without a limp, and that the cut on his ankle had completely healed, and the pain and swelling had gone. That night in bed, she heard her husband talking in his sleep, and he was saying that contact would be re-established by falling down the stairs on November the 2nd, and he continued to sleep talk before falling asleep at 2 a.m. The following morning he awoke in high spirits, but when his wife asked about the UFO, he had no memory of it. She then showed him the notes she'd written, and was surprised by his own handwriting, but could not remember writing anything. She could see he was upset and decided to keep quiet about his nocturnal sleep-talking the previous night. Later that afternoon, the Doctor tripped on the living room stairs, hitting his head on the floor, and miraculously regained all memories of the UFO incident. His wife advised him to contact an old friend by the name of Amy Michelle, who also happened to be a ufologist. 3 days later, Michelle arrived at their home on November the 5th, accompanied by a physicist he'd previously worked with. After arriving, Amy Michelle could see that the Doctor was still in shock and had trouble accepting what had happened the previous night. After interviewing the couple, the physicist took photos of the valley while Michelle added sketches of the UFOs and where they were located in the valley. Michelle also inspected the Doctor's legs and found only faint scarring on his ankle. In the 10 years that the Doctor had had his injuries and had not improved in that time, somehow the Doctor's limp had vanished and he'd regained full control of the muscles. However, later that day he began to feel cramping and pain around his navel, which persisted for 1.5 weeks. The area had become itchy and red. Then on November the 13th, the Doctor had a strange dream in which a triangle appeared in relation to the UFO he'd witnessed, and after a few days the redness developed into a triangle around his navel, and the discomfort stopped. A dermatologist later inspected the triangle, but had no explanation for it. But then a triangle suddenly appeared in the exact same place on his son the following day. For the next 2 years, the triangles appeared on the doctor every 3 weeks, and then on his son 12 hours later. Over the next 20 years, this would happen sporadically, where the triangles usually lasted between 2 to 3 days, then in a few hours would completely fade away. On December the 21st and 22nd, 1968, the doctor had 3 deep hypnosis sessions conducted by a specialist in Bordeaux. Strangely, in the weeks preceding the hypnosis sessions, A.M. Michel had a popular song stuck in his head all day and night and would whistle it endlessly. Strangely though, after the doctor had had his first session, Michel suggested the doctor play something on the piano to help him relax, and began playing the very tune that had been in his head all week. The doctor told Michel that he'd been practicing it all week. Michel noticed that other people associated with the doctor had reported similar coincidences. However, things got even weirder when objects started to appear in random places around the house, and the electricity in the house would turn on and off, and the French electrical authorities could find no reason whatsoever and called it witchcraft and gave up looking. In the end, it fixed itself. On many occasions, the doctor reported suddenly levitating in his bed and elsewhere in the house, and during one of the episodes, he had some flypaper in his hand and stuck it to the living room ceiling 6 metres off the ground, and later showed it to Michel. On many occasions, the doctor would hear a voice saying something would happen on November the 1st, 1969. The date happened to be the first anniversary of the UFO sighting. So he invited Michel and his wife to spend the night at his house. When they arrived, Michel asked the doctor whether the geometry marks had returned on his navel, and he showed him that it was all clear. But later that night, when he was playing the piano, he abruptly stopped playing and stood up and said, "It's here, it's beginning again." He unbuttoned his shirt and everyone could see a triangle take shape on his abdomen that looked like mild sunburn. The following morning, his mother found the same triangle on their son. Although they never discussed the UFO with their son, for the next 2 years he would experience insomnia and would tell his teacher that it would go off into the sky with the big red machine, the one that made a foo-foo noise in the sky with flashes. After the initial shock of what had happened to him, the doctor felt that the event had had a positive effect on his life, especially after he no longer had a limp, and he and his wife had an appreciation of the unexplained, and that whatever had happened to them left them with a sense of peace and was beyond their understanding. The following seance took place on July the 16th, 1966, where a sailor by the name of Terry Smith claimed that he had drowned during World War II after the sinking of his ship HMS Hood. He gives a detailed description of what he discovered when he arrived in the spirit world. He is talking to George Woods and Betty Green, and the medium was Leslie Flint. The following is an edited version of that conversation. Smith: "When I first came over, I was sort of bewildered, like a good many more of the chaps do for that matter. It all happened so sudden, and it was every man for himself. None of us really had a chance. It was hopeless. Now it's fantastic because I'm more alive now than I ever was, and I sometimes come back, but I lost interest in coming back." Betty Green asked him to describe his reactions when he found he was still alive. Smith: "The first thing I remember was going up a street. Although it was a real street, in a sense, not the kind of street that I've been used to. It was all very attractive, lovely trees on either side of the road, and lovely houses. I just couldn't make this out at all. I thought, well, I didn't recognise the place, and yet it seemed as if it could have been somewhere, perhaps in California or something, because it was like I'd seen in pictures. A wide boulevard with trees and sloping lawns. It was like a made-up village, but I couldn't make head or tail of it. But I found that there was nobody else about. It was just as if I was all there on my own. I thought, this is odd. I didn't even realise fully I was dead. I thought I was probably dreaming. But the road was not a bit familiar, yet there was something about it that gave me some sort of peculiar inner confidence. I walked along, and there were all these very pretty houses, and it seemed as dead as a dodo. Not a sound, nothing. Then I came further along, and I saw a very sweet lady, a very pretty woman. She couldn't have looked more than about 28. standing at a little gate. It was the first house that I'd seen with a gate, by the way. All the others seemed to have no entrances, no gates. You just walked up the little path to the front door. But this one was at the end after I'd walked quite a while, and there was this fence around it. And I thought, well, it seems a bit odd. After all, the other houses being free of fences and that. Anyway, this little woman was standing there. She looked young, and yet I felt she was old. It sounds stupid, I know. But she was leaning over this gate, and as I came to her, she sort of smiled. I stopped, and she said, "You looking for something, Sonny?" I thought, blimey. I said, "Yes. I don't know what's happening or where I am." "Oh," she said, "that's all right, Sonny. I've been waiting for you. Come in." So I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose, so I thought I'll go in. So at least it's someone to talk to. And she took me into the front parlour. Nice little room it was, very nice, with chintzy curtains and chairs, and all looked very homely. And there was a cat sitting in one chair, a beautiful black cat. And I thought, can't be dead with cats. She says, "Come on in, Sonny, sit down." So I sat down in the other chair, with no cat in it. She said, "Would you like a drink?" I thought she was going to offer me a cup of tea or something. So I said, "Oh yes, I would, if you please." She said, "Well, what would you like?" So I thought, well, I must go cagey here. I don't want to look as if I drink. So I said, "Oh, I'd like a lemon, please." She says, "Would you? All right." So she goes out and comes back with a glass of lemon. She said, "You've nothing to worry about, Sonny. I've been waiting for you." She said, "Yes." I didn't know what to say. I sat there, and she said, "You're dead." I said, "What?" She said, "You're dead." I said, "Oh, come off it. I can't be dead sitting in a room here with a cat over there and drinking a glass of lemonade. And you're solid and real enough. How can I be dead?" I admit it's all a bit strange. At first I thought I was having a dream or something. She said, "Well, it's no dream, Sonny." She says, "You're dead." I said, "Well, if you say I'm dead, how did I get here?" She said, "Oh, that's all right," she says. "I've been given charge of you." I said, "What do you mean you've been given charge of me?" She said, "Well, when your ship went down," and it suddenly came to me, when the ship went down. The last thing I remember was in the water, holding on to a part of wood. I don't know what part of the ship it was. Anyway, it was a part of wood I was clinging to. Thought it might hold me up, but of course I realised it was hopeless now. "Anyway," she said, "you drowned," she said. "Hundreds and hundreds of lads have come over, and every one of those lads has got someone somewhere to look after them. Some have got their own people, relations or friends. Some have got other souls. I'm one who's in charge of you. You didn't realise, but you were directed. You thought you were walking on your own up the road, but you wasn't. You were being helped by inspiration from a soul whose job it is to help people when they come over suddenly, like you did. Well, don't you worry. You stay with me. I'll look after you. I'll be like your mum." Then she started talking about my people, and it rather shook me because she seemed to know all about my people, about my mum and dad, and how they separated, and about my sister, who was in the Wrens. That's the Women's Royal Naval Service. She seemed to know everything about us. I said, "Well, are you in any way related to us?" She said, "Well, not really, but it was part of my job to know something about your people, being as how I have to look after you." I said, "Well, that's funny since you say I've only just come over. How do you know about my lot?" She said, "Oh, well, that's not difficult. It's only a matter of tuning in." "Tuning in?" I said. "Sounds like the wireless." She said, "Oh, well, we can. If we have any special reason for wanting to know about a particular person or persons, and it's a special work that we have to do, and we've got some sort of connection where that's necessary for us to know things, then we tune in." She said, "A little time later, we'll go to see your people." Well, I said, "Well, that'd be nice." "Of course," she said. "They'll know that you're dead, but they won't know that you're still alive, that you can sort of watch them or go and see them. Now, you mustn't be too upset if no one takes any notice of you." I said, "Well, I did have an aunt who was a spiritualist." She said, "Well, that's good. Perhaps we can get something through in that direction. You never know. We'll have to try her." "Well, for the time being, you must try and be content to be here." She said, I've got a son on Earth, and I'm hoping one day when he comes over that we should be together again. I expect we shall. But in the meantime, I'm going to look upon you as if you're my son. I'm going to do all I can for you and try to make you happy, and you're not to worry, and you're not to feel alone or anything like that. A little later on, when you're rested, she said, this has been a bit of a shock for you. I'll take you out and you'll be introduced to all sorts of interesting people in our community. I said, oh yes, that's very interesting. Then all of a sudden, during the middle of the conversation, this cat did the most funny thing, I thought. It may sound silly, but it jumped off the chair and it came up to me and it sat on its hind legs and looked up at me and it sort of cocked its ears up and it didn't meow. It didn't make the noise like a cat, but it was just as if the thing spoke. Do you know, I nearly dropped. I was so shaken. She said, don't worry, you'll get used to that. The animals over here have developed, to a great extent, their ability to make themselves understood. Of course, on Earth, in a way, they can do that, but we don't hear them speak because they haven't a language as we understand it. But over here, their thoughts are such that they can sort of vibrate the atmosphere, and you can hear the sounds. And it's merely their thoughts being transmitted to you so that you can hear them. Then this cat said, how are you? And I thought, by Christ, this is quite mad. Cats don't say how are you. And I didn't know what to do or what to say. She said, well, don't worry, you get used to that. Animals are much more sensitive than people realise, and they have their own knowledge of things. They can transmit thoughts, and they pick up thoughts, and you'll get used to the fact that animals can convey a great deal more from this side than they can on Earth. Anyway, I responded to the cat and said, I'm very well, thanks. And then the cat seemed as if it said, well, I hope you'll be happy here. Then the cat went back and sat on the chair and curled up, and as far as I was concerned, it went to sleep. Don't worry, she said. You'll understand that animals have a great capacity of understanding, and over here they can transmit their thoughts, the same as I can transmit mine to yours, without even the effort of speaking if I want to. You can read my thoughts, and I can read yours. Thought is a real thing for us, and it's very tangible, and that's why animals can communicate by thought force. Gradually, as I got familiar with everything, and a little time later, she took me out on what appeared to be the sun. She told me later that there was no sun, that it was illumination from all of us. All life was able to draw some sort of power, but the illumination didn't seem to cast shadows. Although in some places the light did cast shadows. It seemed to me as if everything was pleasantly bright without being harsh, and there didn't seem to be any shadows, and it didn't seem it was necessary to withdraw from the light because the light was so pleasing and pleasant. And it wasn't hot. You didn't feel as if it was burning you. It was a pleasant warmth, a sort of radiance, I suppose. Anyway, I went out with her, and she just pulled the door, and I said, well, are you going to lock your door? Oh, she said, there's no need for that here. And much to my surprise, as we went out, the cat got up and walked out and followed us, and was walking along just as it was like you'd expect a dog more than a cat. She's talking away to this cat, and she said, all right, come along, and she kept calling it Nellie. I thought, well, Nellie's a funny name for a cat. I never heard of a cat called Nellie before, and she must have sensed my thoughts, because I found after a short time that I didn't have to speak to her. She knew what I was thinking. Oh, she said, you think it's an odd name for a cat, don't you? I said, well, Nellie, I've never heard of a cat called Nellie. I suppose there's no reason why a cat shouldn't be called Nellie, as well as Tiddles or something. And she said, well, Nellie's the name that my mother gave this cat. I said, your mother? How old is that cat then? Oh, she said, this cat must be now, judging by material age, about 60-odd years old. I said, 60 years old? I've heard cats having 9 lives, trying to make her laugh. She said, well, actually, of course, everybody has many lives. You're having an extension of your life. But you'll find you'll have an extension of this life, and so on ad infinitum. I thought, oh, this is a bit too much for me. She said, you'll grasp it later. You mustn't think that just because you're dead, that you won't have an extension of life to a degree, whereby you'll eventually be able to extend it into another condition of life. I said, I don't quite get that. She said, well, for the time being, don't let it worry you. You'll find that all life is really an extension of a previous life. In other words, you go on and on ad infinitum. You'll exhaust this plane or this sphere or this condition of life in which you are now. Eventually you'll realise that there's nothing more than you can learn here, or nothing more that's necessary to you here, and you'll feel the urge and the need to extend your experience, and you'll pass into a different existence of a higher sphere or plane, where you'll be able to appreciate and learn and experience all sorts of things that you couldn't possibly experience on this. But that may be a long time yet. There's so much that you've got to experience, so much that you've got to learn. You'll have every opportunity given to you to study and to take an interest in so many different things. If you want to, you can do almost anything, whatever you would like to do or be. When you were on Earth, you were very keen, weren't you, on music? I said, how did you know that? She said, well, you were, weren't you? I said, yes, I used to be very keen on the piano, but I was never really good at it. She said, well, you'll have every opportunity here. Is that what you want to do? And to be a really first-class pianist? I said, well, I can't imagine myself being a great pianist. I like good music, and I used to try. She said, oh well, we shall see, won't we? Then later on, when you're more settled and you're more at home, perhaps we'll see what we can do about it. When I came up the road in the first instance, it seemed as if the place was empty. It was like a dead city, with no one at all, yet everything looked trim and nice and clean and fresh, as if everybody had gone off for an afternoon siesta when I arrived. This time going up the road, it was as if everyone was out, standing at the door, or was coming out to the pathway. I hadn't got very far up the road before I was surrounded by people, all sorts of people, mostly young people. One or two seemed to be elderly, and yet, looking back on it, I realised they weren't old, but there was something about them that suggested they were aged, and yet they didn't look old. I can't explain that. They were all shaking me by the hand and calling me by my name, and I thought, that's odd. Everyone knows my name. Everyone's calling me Terry as if they'd known me all their lives. I realised afterwards that there's very little escapes them if a new person coming into the community, or a number of people coming from Earth into that community, which, as I found out afterwards, was a special community, really, of souls whose task it was to help newcomers and to guide them, and especially young people. And with the war on, there was loads of youngsters coming over. They were all around me and making me feel welcome, and I really felt as if I was among old friends. It was extraordinary, yet I didn't know a soul. They all seemed to know me, and I felt quite at home with them. Here I was, arriving in a place where everybody was away, but no one bothered, and now as if they all were coming out to greet me. I thought it was a bit puzzling, so I asked my friend, why is it that when I arrived, no one came to visit me? No one came to meet me or anything? Oh, she said, that was deliberate. Oh, that was very necessary, really. It was partly that you had to, in a subconscious way, for you to come direct to me, and I was the one who was chosen to take care of you. The others knew of your arrival. In every house you passed, you didn't see anyone. Well, their love was so strong that it was helping you, and their thoughts were very real and very tangible. And really, quite frankly, they knew that the right moment would come a little later, once you had adjusted yourself, and you've been helped by me to see and to understand a little. Then you'd be more ready to be received by a lot of people. If we'd all been there, it would have been too much for you. You just wouldn't have been able to grasp things. It was better that it should be as it was. Now you're settling in, you're getting to know people, and people are getting to know you. And the next thing will be, once you really settle down a bit, to find the kind of thing and work you'd like to do. But before that, it may be a very good idea if we go back to Earth and see how your people are, and see if there's anything we can do. She said, it may be very depressing for you, very sad for you, because they don't realise that you're alive, and it will make you unhappy that you can't make contact with them. But you did say that you had an aunt who was interested in spiritualism, so we might be able to do something there, but we'll have to wait and see. George Woods and Betty Green were able to verify with the British Admiralty that Terry Smith was a sailor who went down on HMS Hood and was lost at sea when it was hit by a shell from the German battleship Bismarck in the North Atlantic on May the 24th, 1941.
Frederick had just visited his trusted servant of 20 years, named Parks, in St James Hospital. He had sent an ailing Parks there 3 days earlier for observation and had just heard the doctor's report. Dr. Godfrey Symes, a friend who had known Parks for as long as he, told Frederick that he believed that Parks was suffering from an internal tumour, which could not be diagnosed for certain, but symptoms suggested was malignant. Only an exploratory operation and its removal after 10 days of bed rest could confirm the diagnosis. He suggested that Parks not be told immediately, as he seemed a nervous man and his dread of the procedure might counteract its effectiveness. Dr. Symes undertook to write to Frederick within the week and request that he come up to London to inform Parks. Frederick dreaded the task of telling his devoted servant, who was as much a friend, the news, particularly having heard the experiences of 2 acquaintances with such exploratory operations. While saying that any other treatments, such as violet leaves or x-rays, would be rubbish or quackery, Dr. Symes said that he would have no objection to any remedies Frederick would like to try, as long as they were not harmful. Amidst worrying about Parks, that wintry evening Frederick was expecting 2 visitors, Charles Hope and a medium called Mrs. Forrest. Mrs. Forrest had a considerable reputation in psychical circles and had produced some extraordinary spiritual texts with no imputation of trickery as yet coming near her. When in a trance, she spoke and wrote under the direction of a certain control, that is, a spiritual and discarnate intelligence currently in possession of her. But lately there had been signs that a fresh control had inspired her, their name and identity still unknown. Then eventuated a strange incident. The week before, when in a trance and apparently under the direction of this new control, Mrs. Forrest began describing in detail a certain house where the control said he had work to do. It had suddenly struck Charles that she was speaking of Frederick's house on the coast in Tilling. Her perfectly accurate description of a place she had never seen might conceivably have been derived from Charles' mind, but she added a detail that Charles believed to be incorrect: a big piano near the bow window. Oddly, Frederick had hired a piano only a week ago that stood in the place she mentioned. The control stated that his work of helping a situation in this house would be easier if the medium held a séance there. By the time Mrs. Forrest had come out of her trance, as usual with no recollection of what had passed, Charles had realised that he knew the house and had promised the control that he would do his best. Without telling her of the connection, Frederick and Charles agreed upon inviting Mrs. Forrest to Tilling for a series of sittings. On their arrival at Frederick's house, Charles told him that there was no sign of Mrs. Forrest recognising his house, as she is never aware of the content of her trances. Mrs. Forrest came across as intelligent and practical, with a sense of humour and putting on no airs about her gifts. She explained them as the subconscious part of her getting in touch with discarnate entities, her control using her hand and voice. When asked about her new control, she laughed, as she was, of course, unaware. After dinner, the 3 sat down around a small table with a pencil and paper in case automatic writing took place or the 2 men wished to make notes. Mrs. Forrest leant back until her eyes closed and a violent trembling seized her. Soon her head fell forward and her breathing became very rapid, after which she began to speak in a barely audible whisper. After a first disappointing encounter with a spirit who called herself Starlight, a nun from the time of Henry VII, Mrs. Forrest's voice changed to a low baritone range. This was the new control, Charles whispered across the table. The voice stumbled and hesitated, like someone trying to express themselves in a language they knew very imperfectly. Sometimes it stopped altogether, which was when Frederick asked the person their name. Mrs. Forrest reached out and spelled the word swallow. When asked if this meant the bird, the voice now uttered the words, "Not a bird, but it flies." Then suddenly, with a briskness of movement, as if the guiding intelligence had got over some difficulty, the pencil wrote swallowtail. Charles asked if they meant the swallowtail butterfly, and there came 3 loud raps on the table, which startled the men. When asked again if that was the control's name, there came further raps for both yes and no. Confused, Frederick remembered that he had a book about butterflies and moths, and quickly found the volume. By the firelight, he looked up the butterfly, whose scientific name was Papilio Machaon. When asked, the voice now came clear. "Yes, I am Machaon," it said. The séance lasted no more than an hour, with the then exhausted Mrs. Forrest retiring to her room for the night. Frederick had studied Greek mythology and told Charles that Machaon was the son of the Greek god of healing, who had run hydropathic establishments where people went to be cured. Charles wondered what he could do for his host, who seemed very fit. A light then dawned on Frederick, who, despite worrying on and off about Parkes all day, had not made the connection. Perhaps Machaon was here for Parkes. He found another book which indicated that Machaon had also been a physician. The pair decided to read no more, in case they were suggesting things to the medium's mind, and to hold another séance the following day. Mrs. Forrest did not appear at breakfast, so Frederick sat in a bow window writing letters. Outside, the air bitter and laden with snow. While searching for a word, he looked out the window to the empty street and was surprised to see the figure of a young man walking down the middle of it. The man had black curly hair and wore a large white cloak reaching down to his knees, below which his legs and feet were bare, as was his free arm. As he came immediately outside the window where Frederick sat, he raised his head, looked at him directly and smiled. Frederick suddenly recognised him as the statue of a Greek god, as, with the certainty of one returning home, the figure mounted the steps outside his front door and seemed to pass into it and through it. So real and solid seeming had been Frederick's vision that he ran and opened the front door to see the snow lying smooth and untrodden down the centre of the road where the figure had walked. Frederick's trust of the medium soared, for perhaps Machaon had just entered his house with a smile as of recognition on some friendly mission. At the séance that night, Machaon was at great pains to establish his identity and credentials beyond all doubt, until, during a pause, Frederick asked him a direct question. Had he come to help him with Parkes? What would cure him? The pencil began to move, tracing out characters in Greek, and when the medium came to, they all realised that he had written the Greek equivalent of the English X. That had come in direct answer to Frederick's question as to what would cure Parkes, and he immediately wrote to Dr. Symes. He reminded him that he had expressed no objection to any alternative treatments as long as they were not harmful, and asked him to treat Parkes with X-rays. Frederick had found the whole sequence of events so amazing that he felt that the most extreme sceptic would not have done otherwise. Although the sittings of the 3 continued, there was after that day no further evidence of Mrs. Forrest's second control. It seemed that the intelligence that had described Frederick's house and told the medium that he had work to do there had finished his task. In justification of this view, Frederick received a letter from Dr. Symes a week later, which said that there was no need to come up to London to break the news to Parkes of his impending operation. Without a grain of faith in its success, he had treated Parkes with X-rays, which he acknowledged he had assured Frederick were useless. However, the growth had been steadily diminishing in size and hardness, so that it was very evident that it was being absorbed and disappearing. From the first dose of the X-rays, Parkes had begun to get better, even though all the symptoms had originally pointed to a malignancy. The X-ray treatment was definitely the cause of the cure. Soon Parkes was fully recovered and back home in Tilling. His first task was to post Frederick's reply to Dr. Symes, who had written a postscript. The doctor asked that if it was a voice from the grave that had provided Frederick's advice, could he please be told in confidence who the medium was. Frederick was happy to watch Parkes briskly striding along the street down which Mackay had walked on a snowy morning.